Thank you, Ranjit Hoskote, for joining me today for the multi-species project and for speaking to me. And I look forward to our conversation. Uh, for those of you who don't know Ranjit Hoskote is a cultural theorist, curator, and poet in Mumbai. And he's written, I think, at least 30 books. He's won several very prestigious awards for literature, and it's a real honor that he's agreed to speak with me. I have, as an artist, participated in various ventures of his curation, and it's been a real pleasure to do that. We're also doing some projects together in the near future, so a lot of crossovers, and I constantly learn from his insights. So this is trying to pull you in another direction, Ranjit, of looking at the world outside, looking at the world of nature, of landscapes, through your hat as a cultural theorist, as a curator, but also as a poet and a master of languages. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about, and for you to reflect on what these terms mean and how we relate to this complex and vague term called nature.
Indeed.
And but before that, as you had suggested, I had sent those photographs in case you wanted to react as an opener to any of them. But I leave that to you. So if you like to react to that, and we can have a conversation after that.
Definitely. Ravi, it's a great pleasure to be in conversation with you. As always, I've really benefited and learned a great deal from you in conversation and collaboration over these many years. And yes, we've worked together on so many projects now, and they all stand out for me. Certainly Detour, which we did together in 2009, an exhibition that engaged with the afterlife of Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. Then Zameen, which we did in 2014, where again, there were questions that we had in common about what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to connect with non-abstract questions of how people do in fact belong to locality, to livelihood, to occupations, to articulations of the self through various media at a time of turbulence and change. And I've also been in great admiration of the way in which your own practice has opened up in different directions, from your ecological, environmental activism, which continues, to your art making, to your own exploration of other landscapes and other languages. So when you shared this set of images and the title, which intrigued me greatly, Samtal Jameen, Samtal Jameer, I was very struck by the title. And the images, of course, are deeply moving. I mean, they bring into play the ways in which human and animal life are blended in ways that we might not imagine if we address this question of the natural world through a more conventional optic of the sovereign human self, which is purely served by a nature that has been instrumentalized. So even if it's the little boy from the fishing community who's holding this amazing silver colored flashing fish, which is somewhere between life and death, and then you realize that, you know, the life of one means the life of the other. And although you might be disposed to see this as a cycle of human exploitation of a natural resource, the way in which these communities have traditionally parsed that relationship also involves a great deal of respect for the life cycles of the fish, the life cycles of the sea, something that's being completely taken away by mechanized fishing, by factory ships. Here in Bombay, we see a lot of your work has been done, I know, on the Coromandel coast. But here in Bombay, for instance, our local indigenous fishing community here is up against many of these same issues. So that's, you know, images like that really represent for me these major questions of how we are mishandling how we live in consonance with nature. Also, when you dwell on scrublands and grasslands, when you look at children working in a brick kiln, the numbers of there's a certain density of questioning that comes through, and it's articulated through powerful and memorable images. So it's not a didactic way of presenting these political problems. We really approach it through the immediacy of dwelling on the image of that child laborer and thinking of what might the other degrees of freedom have been for this child. What does it mean when certain standardized forms of making bricks at scale to feed a burgeoning real estate industry, when that comes in, what happens to idioms of brick making that go back hundreds and hundreds of years, that have been developed in closer relation to where the resources come from and which are more diverse. So I found myself thinking there also of how the diversity of occupations is being flattened, and traditional ways of doing things which sustain a more robust vernacular architecture, these are vanishing. So these were some of the thoughts, but I really wanted to ask you, Ravi, about your title. How did you come to that title?
So I've been thinking a lot about, a lot of my work is about lived landscapes, and in the broad framework, what we call social, or more popularly called environmental justice, that whose environment, whose benefit does it serve, and who is the world for? And it also have been recently thinking of the last couple of years about how do we bring agency to the idea of nature, to the multi-species worlds, and is there a connection between these two frameworks? Because, as you know, the natural world is not represented in our justice frameworks. Justice is a complicated word anyway, but even our legal frameworks don't deal with the natural world. And we are also always meant to speak for it, but it doesn't speak for itself. Even though there's this whole new thinking now of what they call eco symbiosis, or where they are seeing how animals express themselves through various kinds of gadgets and learn a language. But to me, that the idea of ecological landscapes, and that's why the images of that little girl with bricks in her head was posed, because at some point, people who live on and off the earth also have a part of that complex relationship. And when you preserve ecosystems, you probably do justice to both, to the complexity and to the idea of the human. And for me, a lot of the idea of the future of the human is about the position, the power positions the human takes. At what point does the human become the non-animal historically? At what point does the animal become the residue of the human, even though we are animal, but we don't consider ourselves animals. So at some point in history, we have started doing that, and almost like an ontological rupture in ourselves. And then when we think of a world where even biologically we see that we may not be in a hierarchical position, but in a co-evolution, co-evolved position where our bodies are full of multiple organisms. So we come to a point which is of equality, that we are part of Samtal Jameen, equal selves, equal landscapes, that we belong to the same place in a sense, and we are formed by the same processes, not separate from them. And even DNA-wise, we have very little difference from our nearest animal ancestors.
Very true.
So it came from that, and it's really this project was really trying to explore, because it's a conceptual question, and of course academia is trying to answer it in certain ways, But I think there's a lot more to be said through different voices. And that's how this title came about, as a proposition of what that might mean.
I responded very strongly to the title because, of course, as I said, both of us have thought about the question of Zameen in different ways. But invoking Zamir is more than only the given self. It's also speaking to the moral consciousness.
That's it.
The idea that it's a conscience at work, and that we really, as having had the sovereign position as a species for centuries, and in a more well-defined instrumentalizing kind of way for the last 300 or 400 years, it actually falls to us to give up some of that sovereignty and to exercise more the moral consciousness. And I've in different language and in different ways of arrival at the same question, I've been thinking, for instance, of three particular things in recent years. One is the debate around the personhood of rivers, which you also alluded to when you were speaking of how our forms of justice don't really recognize the rights of nature or what we take to be natural features. There's a way of arriving at this in a more, if you will, secular kind of way, to recognize that rivers have rights not to be violated. But in India, I wouldn't say I'm troubled by, but I would be somewhat anxious about the way in which we move quickly past the personhood of rivers and move to the divinity of rivers, which then doesn't, even in the recent judgment in Uttarakhand, wasn't it?
That's
where the appeal is again to a kind of scriptural sanction, where I don't know how useful that is, because we continue to, everyone says Gangaji, and yet that's the very river that you defile. You pray there in one moment and you utterly defile it and pour effluents into it further down the stream. So how do we manage to arrive in the discourse of justice at something like a viable personhood of rivers, for instance, is one strand of this debate that I've been preoccupied by. Alongside that is also a question of how we've responded to rivers. And this came to me very, very strongly last year or the year before, when I had a conversation on Twitter with Amitangshu Acharya, who's done a great deal of work on the anthropology of rivers, the cultural anthropology of rivers. And I'd written a piece about the river in culture and in our social and political life, and characterizing it as the place that had always been thought of as the tirtha, the ford between the here and the beyond. And he gently reminded me that I hadn't touched in any way on Dalit narratives of the river. And I was struck by how, even with the best of intentions, the most responsive sensibility in terms of these questions of justice, there are some things that evade you, and life is constantly about learning about our own cultural blind spots and deficits. And I began to think about that. Later, when Mukul Sharma was speaking in the marvelous series that you convened and curated, State of Nature, there were some young friends who were astonished that he argued that one's sense of the environment and of recycling or relationship with the environment has a lot to do with one's position in a power hierarchy. To a certain kind of privileged urban elite, it's all about sorting your garbage and recycling plastic and all the rest of it. But for someone at the other and more vulnerable end of the pyramid, these are indulgences. There are other ways in which you have to address much more sharply etched questions of how to coexist with nature. So these are some of the questions I've been thinking about. But also in recent years, I've been thinking about how we've, through the colonial period and a colonial discourse of silviculture, we have really utterly mischaracterized our forests, such that even when national policy is legislated in the form of a Forest Act, we're still working with notions of the forest that really have to do with the plantation, which, as you know, is the boot mark of colonialism.
Right.
Whether it was in Ireland or Jamaica or India, wherever colonialism went,
That's true.
it took the plantation, it took bonded labor, it took slavery, and it took the draining of resources. So this is something that I've also been thinking about, how when we think of forests, we're really thinking of plantations. And we're also omitting to take into account all kinds of other genres of landscape which don't fit this particular bill because they tend to be thought of as useless. We've talked about this before. Wetlands, for instance, or scrubland, and everything that goes with it, and the animals, insect, bird species that inhabit those kinds of spaces, and the livelihoods, the people, the communities associated with these places.
That's true. And I think these complexities have only recently started being explored because there was this homogenizing project about nature and man, that the human is homogeneous and nature is homogeneous, and
Yes.
they became sort of mutual actors in a sense of a two-person play, where in reality it's a multi-character play with multiple inroads into each other's lives, and branches coming out of the human and the human coming out of the grass, kind of thing. It's a much more complex relationship, and somehow these relationships have started have become very firmed up. Ideas of self have become firmed up. What constitutes nature, what constitutes knowledge about nature, has become firmed up. The word nature itself has its boundaries, from the outside inside, and it becomes like I think Karen Barat talks about it as a epistemological, ontological sort of shift. We have, so the idea of what you raised first, the ethical rudder, is such an important part of the human, in a sense. What drives you to do what. So a relationship of reciprocity, which indigenous people have with nature, they don't take with impunity. That scale of how much to take seems like a scale of ethics, but it's also a scale of very firm empiricity of life, of survival, in a sense. They know that this will come back and we need it. So so that's the word I used, which actually a friend of mine used, guided me towards some time back, of the ontological rupture. When did that take place? When did we start becoming more human and less animal, in a sense, even though we are not completely, and we consider ourselves separate from nature? And I think, as you know, from my very sort of amateurish explorations into Sangam poetry, of which I found fascinating because of its evoking the idea of nature as a backdrop to human life, not as something which is instrumentalized to human life. It's a backdrop in which human life happens, in a sense, which was 300 BC. It's like such an old place. And you see this throughout. When I was in Scotland doing printmaking, I was looking at this. I think it's called the Ogimi alphabet, which is the old Gaelic alphabet, where the sign language now lost, in a sense. So these are, to me, windows into looking at the pre-ontological rupture, if you want to use, of the self and animal, in a sense, a codependency and not or something of impunity. But we are in the times we are right now, so that is also a reality. It's really something which is I love to hear more about from you. Is how does language shape this idea of what we think? And different languages have different expressions of complexities which get lost in translation. And you're both a translator and a poet. What better? How can we imagine a different world with different languages? What has been lost? What are we losing? And is there a way to bring these cultural imaginations back, which are actually, this nature culture is a very sort of contested term, but culture is probably more hard-faced to me than we recognize, not just a soft power.
Absolutely.
Culture defines our ourselves, not our physical self, but ourselves of who we are in a sense. Whether we will torture somebody to death or we will treat somebody with respect is as much a cultural question as a question of power. So I think underexplored in this whole nature question, which I keep reading about, the political question in its capital and industrial and its climate change kind of, but one doesn't hear this question of language so much. And I think it's a very unexplored area. And I know you have been thinking and talking about this. So it'd be wonderful to hear from you. What are your thoughts on it and what would you think about? I think those are broad questions, but it's an open canvas.
Sure. Let me try and approach this also because we've touched on this in previous conversations. At one point, I characterized this linguistic resonance of the ontological rupture as a split between the language of policy, which comes from the technocratic sense of control and expert culture and the subjugation of nature on one side. And on the other side is what I characterized as languages of generosity, which open up to the natural world, which open up to the fact that human life and natural life cycles are in fact closely interpenetrated. So when we look back or look around, for instance, in the Mughal period, you find that there's an accent on being a kind of person who's a member of the Ahl-e-Zawq, which is sometimes translated as people of taste. And by this, the misunderstanding is that this means some kind of hedonistic, voluptuary person participating in court culture and its delights. But that's not actually what it is. It's much more a sense of someone who leads a life that is in consonance with season, place, locality, local resources. It really becomes a marvelous compendium of thinking about how to lead one's life, as people did for generations, for centuries, in terms of natural shifts in a way that didn't endanger the self. And you find it, for instance, in Ayurvedic or Unani medicine. It's very clear that it is the human subject that needs to accommodate to the larger cycles. And in doing so, you produce culture. What you wear in winter, what you wear in the monsoon, what do you eat in each season? Not only is all of this part of a sense of health and hygiene and what is really good for the bodily organism, it also then articulates itself through external forms of being together, of self-representation. And it comes across in story, in song, in rituals, in the whole panoply of life, and which makes for a certain kind of, I have to say, cultural coherence, in which the individual is not just conscripted into some culture. There's a rationale for it. I mean, all this sounds incredibly idealistic now, but it's interesting to think back to a time when festivals weren't just meant for idle, letting off of steam, but they actually were liminal moments, the thresholds of transition from one time in not only your individual life, but you recognize that the whole country and the planet were moving. There's something powerful about, what Carl Sagan called the little blue dot. Your recognition at these moments of seasonal shift that you're participating in a universal drama. And we've really lost that sense to a great extent. Over at another end of the scale, I was just reading Anvita Abe's book, Voices from the Lost Horizon, which is, as you know, about it's a cultural anthropology of the indigenous communities of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And repeatedly in her interviews with people there, she keeps recording how there's hardly any proper speaker of the Andamanese languages anymore. And there's not a single language. I mean, there are many languages through the island, through the archipelago. And it was heartbreaking to read how that culture has been systematically destroyed by state intervention. Our children are taken away in the name of progress from their communities, brought up in some kind of boarding school ethos in a town settlement type place, and how they're gradually alienated from their more symbiotic way of being, and are then taught to believe that this is actually the way to do things. Many years ago, I was on the sidelines of a film that Nancy was making in the interiors of Maharashtra. She eventually called it Khichdi Ek Khoj. It began as an inquiry into malnutrition deaths of infants in Melghat, and then gradually built into it expanded the documentary form. She really examined all aspects of this district level power system and what it was actually doing. And there, one of her sequences, not all of it went into the final film, but she showed me the footage and the rushes. It was about how, with apparently the best intentions, non-governmental organizations were going in and presenting, a very positivist sense of how science and antibiotic medicine were going to help with things, which indeed they do. But this was being done at the expense of satirizing, ridiculing, and marginalizing the traditional shamanic forms of medicine, the figure called the Bomka, who, when Nancy had a conversation with him, turned out to be perfectly reasonable. He spoke to her about how he was in retreat, not only because there was no longer a climate of belief, but because there was no longer access to what he needed to make his medicines with. It was a perfectly cogent and coherent system that depended on medicinal resources that could be made from local herbs and plants and so on. And large-scale forces were destroying the world in which this Bomka, this so-called folk medicine man, had a useful contribution to make. And he was perfectly willing to see that, what he characterized as medicine from the city would help. He wasn't opposed to it. What was tragic is that he and the entire life, the form that he stood for, was sought to be erased. So I'm struck by how there's such an insane belief in the efficacy of a positivist way of doing things. I'm not for one moment saying that we need to take contrast everything that appears in the name of tradition. But we know that some forms of tradition were developed in close synergy with a particular environment, with local forms of exploration of nature, which were respectful, which were dependent on mutuality. All this is being erased. So when I think about how indigenous forms of knowledge are being marginalized, when vocabularies are disappearing, in Anvita Abi's account of the Andaman and Nicobar, she says that they don't have words any longer for certain kinds of birds, certain kinds of fish, certain geographical features. That's being replaced by a more flat Hindi or English kind of terminology. So this is what we're going to lose, because often, for instance, I always think back to this grassroots level activist in the Thar desert. You've worked with him yourself. Sorry, Ravi?
Chatar Singh.
Chatar Singh, indeed, yes. Yeah. I mean, that incredible vocabulary of cloud forms. I mean, I'm deeply moved and I'm struck by it. How through the poetics of these cloud forms, this community is able to connect with something that is completely beyond human control, but they, in some ways, create a bond between human life cycles and cosmic or meteorological life cycles. And this then becomes an account of how to find consonants. This is, I think, something that's completely vanished. Also, to take a completely, banal, everyday example, the fact that today, certainly those privileged enough to access a certain kind of supermarket in the cities, we just assume that what we want to eat will be available around the year. And there's a small ethical choice that can be made there, that you recognize that this is only happening because the earth is being compelled to work itself round and round, being poisoned with fertilizers, and so that you can have whatever fruits you like around the year, instead of in their proper season. So I think this affects us at all levels. These choices that we make, at the level of languages that are being lost and the kinds of knowledge that they carry, which also is, certainly what it is going to involve is an unlearning, almost more than a learning. But it's an unlearning on a considerable scale, because it also means that we then have to apprentice ourselves to people at the margins, even as they struggle to find their place and try and get closer to the center. This is something, I know you've worked a lot in these areas, so I'd really want to know more from you about this, because sometimes there is also a rather romantic urban idea that, we'll run out to the villages and, we'll find these marvelous natives who are there. And when you get there, you probably realize that they're struggling in the opposite direction to try and get some benefits from a monolithic, alienating, exploitative system.
Yeah, I think we haven't developed a society on the basis of well-being, but a certain notion of progress, which is defined in a certain kind of progress. And what I see is that when you think of extinction, I think extinction is a fascinating term to think of, including of languages. And then when you we think of extinction in categories of what we've defined, and then we say that that becomes extinct. For example, the vulture becomes extinct, but it's not the vulture which has become extinct. It's a whole ecosystem around which the vulture, in which the vulture exists, that breaks apart. And also the co-evolutions it has produced, they disappear. And the future evolutions they can trigger off, they no longer can happen. So there's a dramatic change when you take out something like that. And also the way we prioritize something is also a question of what those words mean. So you may not think of the vulture as the vulture, but as something else, like you can describe it in a completely different way, like a bird of something, a bird of, And so when you take away those categories and create new categories, then also you mentioned that now in the Andaman still languages are disappearing and being replaced by this homogenizing Hindi or whatever, which is also a project nationalism, interesting.
It is.
Project. Then as a translator, what are the challenges when completely different concepts which are not easy to contain in another language? How do you deal with that?
In different ways, actually, depending on what the text is. Sometimes you have to accept that there are limits to translation, which is really also translation in itself, a translation of an ethical realization that you can't bend every language to the will of your language. So in that case, you go the other way and you actually surrender your language to what you're translating from. And I find that in that moment, you suddenly recognize that there is a colonialism to translation, and always has been, or for a long time has been, where you assume that everything from another place, another language, often a marginalized or vulnerable language, will become available to you because yours is the master language. It's a salutary ethical exercise sometimes to say, no, this resists what I have at my command, and therefore I will accommodate it. I will bring it in, and my readers will have to do a little hard work to grasp it. So then you might be inspired to invent a new word, which is the effect that the source language has on the language you're translating into. So rather than have everything flattened or contoured to your language, you actually find yourself improvising and reinventing, which is actually a wonderful space of mutuality to be in. Sometimes you import the word as it is, and that becomes it becomes an extension of your language. So that's a more redemptive
Does
way.
some example come to your mind immediately as we speak?
The one that comes to me is for instance, in the work that Sampurna Chatterjee has been doing from, translations of Joy Goswami, the Bengali poet, and her translation of Shukumar Rai's Abol Tabol, which is a celebrated text of whimsy. It's thought to be for children, but like all nonsense verse, it also has very strong political and cultural references. And when she was working on that, she really had to completely invent a third language. So it forces you to remake your understanding of what you take to be a stable knowledge of your language. It pushes you into fields of inquiry and invention in another language. It speaks to curiosity and adventure. So it's not just translation as a means of making something understood. Sometimes translation can become a means of very deliberately bewildering the reader, because bewilderment and the curiosity and adventure are ways in which the reader's consciousness can be expanded and sensibility can be transformed.
And would you say when you move to a culturally more diverse landscape, for example, English and Hindi or Sanskrit, so even within the subcontinental landscape, there are several languages which have their own nuances of understanding, and local languages like in the Andamans, which there are many, so they have specific relationships. But as you move away further and further away from them, then I think there's several words which we think of nature. Even Prakriti doesn't really translate to nature completely. So there are these already a step in the master language of Hindi where you are sort of collapsing meaning, but there's a further step into a completely different personhood space or a cultural space in the West, in a sense. And how do you deal with those differences? And can you think of some example which deal with nature or landscape or something like that?
I'm trying to think. So much of this has to do with a peopled landscape. For instance, I've been working on Mir Taqi Mir's poetry in the last few years. It's Urdu in a historical moment where it's very, very diverse as linguistic texture. It's drawing on Braj Bhasha, it's drawing on Khadi Boli. It's really Hindavi. And it's really marvelous to learn those lessons, because you realize that you're not even simply translating from one language anymore. You're using all kinds of different sorts of vocabularies. But the landscapes that he often describes, because he's living at a time when the Mughal Empire is really in a state of collapse, the constant invasions, it's the ravaged landscape that leaps out of the poetry, and you begin to think of how do you find correlates for some of these words. Maybe I'll read something.
Yeah, that'll be great.
And yeah, I'll just
fantastic.
Super. Let me just do this. Like virane me, to be in a viran, what does that mean? For instance, so I'm just going to read a couple of the ashar, the verses, and like, how do you describe a wasteland, for instance? Yes. Okay, here comes Mir, who says, Dil ki virani ka kya mazkur hai, ye nagar 100 martaba loota gaya. Of the heart's ruination, what report? This city's been looted 100 times over. But you know that, this Dil ki virani ka kya mazkur hai, of its ruination, it's an evacuated landscape.
Yeah.
But the same term is also used when one finds oneself in a space of desolation.
Yeah, thinking of the word desolation.
Yes, so very, very much this sense of the isolation of the human subject. I'm going to just see where my Ghalib translations are, which are here. There's one or two which are very intriguing indeed. Well, Nope, not here, alas, Ravi. But I might just
No.
continue with
Yeah.
with Mir.
Sure.
Now, for instance, how in Mir, also in Ghalib, but in Mir with great piquancy and poignancy, how is the notion of a homeland described? So, for instance, he says, "धूप में जलती हैं गुर्बत वतनों की लाशें, तेरे कूचे में मगर साया ए दीवार न था." The sun burns up the corpses of those driven from their homeland. Your lane did not offer them even the shadow of a wall.
Yeah.
So Ghurbat Watan, someone who has been erased from their country,
Cast away.
Yeah, exactly. Cast away, the sense of the outcast. I mean, that's just so powerful here.
Yeah.
And one more on the homeland, which
It
is
all draws a violent desert-like landscape in my head.
yes, yeah. And I'll maybe just read one more because it's a very strange and powerful image. एक जगह पर जैसे एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है लेकिन चक्कर रहता है, यानी वतन दरिया है उसमें चार तरफ है सफर में अब. एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है लेकिन चक्कर रहता है, यानी वतन दरिया है उसमें चार तरफ है सफर में अब. Like the whirlpool, still center of a giddy circling, the homeland's an ocean on which we're scattered in all directions.
Wow, that's beautifully translated. Actually,
Thank you.
It's a complex verse couplet.
Exactly, very much so, because the very stability of where you belong is taken away. I mean, the homeland is an ocean. Suddenly, you can't map directions, and it's a whirlpool.
Yeah, but you've also written specifically on landscapes yourself.
Yes.
Would you care to read some of that?
Sure, I will actually. Let me read one. It's from a much earlier book. It's called Landscapes with Saints. Okay, it goes like this. Landscapes with Saints. Mean as knives, his burnished limbs rotted and stank when the gateman came to call his number. Gorakh forgot his body was just a borrowed suit, one size too large. He's forgotten the river pilot's song. He's above parrot gossip, beyond the hawk's warning cry. Wrapping himself in the torn fabric of sky, Kabir climbs on. Dropping his nimbus in the grass, he looks at the boats riding the stream below, close enough to touch. When the road ends, Tuka takes a deep breath and leaps. She sees a boatman rowing in sand, shielding his skiff from the ocean's roar. Such a safe harbor, brother, sings Lalla. It saves you the trouble of charting your course. His eyes would not rest on a quatrain of walls and scanned the desert air instead. Mango trees balancing on their heads, himself Khushru, a bird of paradise judged by earth. Neglect leafs through his pages. Perfumes escape from files left unstoppered on his shelves. Lead crumbles in Attar's mind. His hands, wherever they rest, touch gold. A torn cotton robe against the wind, his limbs nettle pricked, transparent as prayers. His name burnt out, Milarepa sings to himself as he travels the centuries.
Wow, what a beautiful and vast canvas you draw. What prompted you to write this?
This was written many years ago, but I came to it actually both from landscape and painting,
Mm.
partly because I was born in Bombay, but I spent my first few years up to the age of 7 in Goa in the early 70s, when it was really very unspoiled. And we lived really in a house on a hill with kind of a forested tract right behind. So, and coming to Bombay was then really a culture shock and a nature shock, from which I don't think I recovered for many, many years. Just the sense of growing up in complete proximity with the natural world. And then in the city, having only an extremely stylized contact with nature, that was a big shift. So often in my poems, I tend to return to these experiences of being more directly in connection with trees, for instance, it might be. And the form of the poem was, I really wanted to do a set of miniature portraits.
Yeah.
Thinking about these saints, whether it was Gorakhnath or Tukaram or Lal Ded or Amir Khusro, and thinking about the fluid link between the natural world and their own forms of settlement and seeking and going on a journey.
Yeah, and I think this resonates to a lot of your poetry, doesn't it? These figures resonate. This sense of kind of self, which these characters, with these poets you have mentioned, and these almost saint-like people you have mentioned.
Yes.
They resonate. This idea of a kind of relationship with the world outside resonates throughout many of your poems.
True.
Yeah. And you also wrote this book called Joanna's Whale.
Jonah Whale.
Jonah
Whale, yes.
In which there's a poem which you'd earlier read out I don't know if you still have it, when we were talking in the Girls Institute. If you like to read that too, that was a lovely poem. I don't know if you remember that. It was on the ocean.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and which speaks of languages, of course.
That's right.
Of course.
Yeah.
To do that. Yeah. Yeah. It's called Ocean, literally.
It's called Ocean.
Yeah. I'll just get that out and you will read it. Okay. Sorry, Ravi, I'm just reading off
the
computer right now, but yeah. Okay, the poem is simply called Ocean, and it goes like this. My name is Ocean. I shall not be contained. My tides spell starting gun and finish line. Afterwards, only shells and scattered roofs will remind you I was there. My combers wash away the roots of trees, towns, the shaken heart. But mortals, there's hope. My breakers hurl seeds back at your shores. After the flood, the chroniclers will write in Konkani, Sabir, Aymara, Tulu, Jarawa, Creo, Tokpisin. After the flood, the beach exploded with giant peacock trees, in whose branches on windy days you could hear the surge and swell of ocean summoning whales, whalers who chased blood wakes, red-haired women who fought pirates, sleepless harpooners who sailed from fjordlands to where volcanoes splintered the sleeping ice, furies who choked pearl divers, drove catamarans aground, voyagers who fell into the sea and grew wings, ocean reciting from his depths every drifting epic of pursuit, every song of shipwreck, every trace of raft and sail and trailing anchor, flotsam, jetsam, buckram, vellum, he could remember.
This has got so many images of the ocean. They couldn't be coming from one place. It's like an expanse. It's like an expanse of the ocean across time and across places.
Yeah. It comes from just, for one, I've pretty much always lived by the sea. Yeah. Or somehow whenever I've lived elsewhere, I've really, by serendipity, found myself near a river or a lake. And that response to how the oceans have united us, whilst often land has been a source of division, is something I'm fascinated by. So in the poem, you again hear of different sorts of
You hear of shipwreck, floods, peacock trees,
yes,
all kinds of images. It's
yeah,
almost like a meta landscape you create.
yes, yeah, absolutely, and also about the things that happen. I mean, there is, of course, I mean, there's a powerful destructive potential to the sea, and
Yeah.
we all know this. But there's also a thread in that poem which has to do with language, because the chroniclers are all chronicling in languages that uh, are either endangered or very close to being extinct. So Jarawa is mentioned, for instance. All are languages that were generated through the life of the sea, sort of sea languages. So there's also that reference to.
I want to ask you one question, because you are also, you write on art, you curate, you're a cultural theorist, you have this other many hats. And what is the role of our affective ways of being in the future of reimagining the world? Uh, how do we relate the what we call the evidentiary part of our knowing and the affective parts of our knowing? And is there a way in which these these ways in which we inhabit ourselves and the world can be expressed in a powerful enough way, or in a manner in which we can change something in the future?
You're absolutely right, Ravi. I think a certain a certain kind of affective uh, approach to what we do as people in the cultural sector sphere is crucial, because without that sort of passionate commitment and without that sense of empathy and the releasement of the self to what we're doing, we would then be as technocratic as anybody else. You know, uh, there's a way in which we tend to valorize work in the cultural sphere as being somehow already connected to creativity, already connected to forms of transcendence. But in the doing of it, so often, we become, as we tend to objectify what we're doing, we instrumentalize things. And I think it's a constant challenge to step away from that and continue to never forget the uh, the locales that we engage with as artists or as poets or as curators, and to always be mindful, I think, of how very important the affective is, that we can't simply offer a kind of technical account of what we do, or do it only because it aids in the sustaining a certain trajectory. But this would also call for the development of different kinds of platforms, a different scale, a different speed, even, I think, in how we do things. And looking for solidarities that will always surprise and bewilder us. I think that's how the affective really comes into play, because otherwise it's, often we know this, having worked in the gallery system, with museums, with other institutions, there's a way in which a certain kind of protocol kicks in. And it's only when you're outside that space, you might be working in maybe a space of research, which is not as dry as it seems, uh, or you're working across the arts, you're just in a space where you're learning something else and collaborating to produce a third thing. For me, that's continuously a challenge that actually helps us to affectively, as well as in intellectual ways, uh, refine and make our practices more intense.
And how you actually uh, uh, engage with the political sphere in your thinking, and as well as the affective sphere in your practice, as well as in your reading of other artists' works. And is there a way in which they can speak with each other in a more integral kind of manner, or is it always sort of inherent to one in the other? And or is there a way in which an aesthetic practice can be formed in which we think about this as together? in a sense, or does it always play at a subliminal level of appearance in the practice of a poet or an artist?
I think there are different points of conjuncture, but sometimes it's subliminal. At other times, such as the one that we're in right now in the present, it becomes very, very overt and clear that a certain response is called for. But that response to the political really has to be framed and parsed and formed through formal shifts that you make in your own art making practice, I think, because otherwise you run the risk of sloganeering or creating pictures of politics. My problem with a lot of so-called politically oriented art is that it descends into posturing because it doesn't find occasions of shift and clarification and illumination within its own practice. It just sort of sets up a fairly easy analog to something that's going on in the political, whilst making no particular change in its own ethos. So that to me has always been a source of some anxiety.
And is it easy to spot for you as somebody who watches art making very closely?
Unfortunately, yeah.
And where does the role of ethics come in aesthetics? I know it's a very broad question, but just as a thought.
I think, for instance, in very definite, specific ways, it would have to do with how, for instance, you use narratives that might not be your own. What is the way in which you bring them? And for instance, I found myself dealing with this question in one of the other poems, a long poem in Jonah Whale. It's a polyphonic poem, which is called Cargo and Ballast. And it has to do with a particularly brutal moment in the history of the Atlantic slave trade, where a ship called the Zong ran into problems, and the brutal crew thought the best solution to this was to throw enslaved people overboard. So literally a few hundred West African people who had been enslaved were just massacred, were just thrown overboard. So this is something that's resonated for me. And Turner has a great painting on this. So
which one do you remember?
Ship in a Typhoon, slave traders throwing slaves overboard. It's right. A long title.
Yes.
It's, you know the one. It's in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts.
Yeah.
So what I did finally with the poem is that it became an extended dialogue with Edouard Glissant, the philosopher and poet from Martinique. So I quote him and I address him in the poem, and also, you know, because it's written like an opera libretto, there are different voices. So I also use material from the original court case, where the judge who tried the crew said that there was nothing he could do to sway the jury, because in that time and place, slaves were regarded as goods. So the crew argued that these were goods that were going to go bad. They were perishable. So they had to be got rid of to save the goods that were still good. So the judge records his horror at such thinking, but his inability to do anything about it because he's bound by a law that is already cruel and inhuman. So there's some element of that verdict there. It's a kind of collage. It's a montage of different things, the poem. So I resolved my ethical question in that case by making it a polyphony, a multitude of voices, and as a dialogue with somebody whose history this was. Glissant. It's also written about it.
Right.
So that was, so you devise different forms of ethical responses. But in more recently in this new book, Hunch Prose, there's it opens
your latest book.
My latest book,
which I just got a copy of yesterday.
Oh my, that's wonderful to know, Ravi.
Yes.
Gosh, so you'll see the opening poem is called Siddhi Mubarak Bombay. It is in the voice of an enslaved person here in Bombay in the 19th century. So there I had a different set of questions, because I didn't feel constrained that this was somehow someone else's history. This was very much part of my history. It's my city. This man lived here, was a fellow Bombay person. So I use a different set of literary strategies there. I kind of try and see if I can involve myself in his linguistic consciousness. So when you read the poem, you'll see he's navigating through his own multiple belonging in different regions, different languages, who he was in Bombay, who he is in Zanzibar. So I think there are different ways of bearing ethical witness through your aesthetic choices.
But it's a choice. It's a choice an artist has to make.
Absolutely. But then also, and I mean, there was someone, a much younger person came to me, an Indian, who said, oh, but what about this question of, not appropriating someone else's narrative? I thought to myself, and I said actually to him that we are not all participants in an American history. The Atlantic trade was a brutal fact of history. But the people who have to be cognizant of that are those who benefited from it, who are descended from the oppressing elite. With us in India, we have another way of addressing this, which we have to address in our own particularity here. When we think about, for instance, the African presence in India, it has to do with a very, very different set of cultural and political relationships. And we have to find other languages and other forms of dealing with it instead of simply taking a new woke vocabulary and attitude. Right. Of course, we have to deal with it with mutuality and respect, but we come to it from other histories, from the history of the Siddhi presence among us as part of our culture and our politics, because some of the Siddhis rose to be even rulers of places. Yet they were also farm laborers, they were house slaves. So we have to find a different ethical idiom in which we bear witness to this and to these figures who are simultaneously from elsewhere, but of us and us as well.
So I can speak to you for long, but I think we also need to end. Unless you have something to ask me, then it was a fascinating conversation. So because I do think that the issues you touch upon are the politics of oppression, suppression, violence, and our means of responding to them is integrated with the idea of reimagining new worlds where we are Samtal Jameen, Samtal Jameer, because they're not separate. It's an ethical, political, and also an ontological question to my
Yes, absolutely. So I actually do have a question for you, Ravi, which is I'm fascinated by how this project will play out. So the way that I understood it was that it was going to be a wonderful montage across media.
Yeah.
So what forms will Samtal?
So it'll be many voices. Well, for the first bit, I'm trying to get at least 25 voices from across the world. People I know engage with this at different kinds of practices. And to me, it's about opening up the question and seeing, once that is there as material, where does that lead to?
Right.
So it's a first. It's a project of listening.
That's wonderful.
And so this is really that's what it's about. It's about listening to voices and listening to methods, listening to practices. And I'm hoping to speak to academics, artists, people like you, but also to scientists.
Indeed, yes.
People who are working with different kind of neurological ideas, and so I'm trying to look for people who are willing to talk to me. And the first bit is this, and we'll see how it goes. And to me, it's I think for me always practice is a powerful way of expression.
Absolutely.
And at least it's my way of expression. So, and I think hoping people will relate to that
absolutely. I mean, it's when you put it like that, a project of listening, I think that's such a crucial form of extending oneself. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ranjit.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to speak to you, as always. Yeah.
Likewise.
Okay.
Just it's marvelous as always, Ravi.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. See you. Bye.